Thank you, Michelle, for my introduction. Okay, good morning, everyone. So my honours project was the impacts of scuba diving at Sodwana Bay. So I'm just tackling this from a different perspective. So coral reefs attract a lot of attention, and this is due to their beauty and their diversity. But more than that, they provide us with vital goods and services like your coastal protection and benefits to tourism and fisheries. But these reefs are very fragile and they are susceptible to damage, and despite this, they are still threatened by coastal anthropogenic disturbances, so like your coastal development, overexploitation, and of recent topical importance, climate change, which has become a scientific reality, bringing with it new threats to these coral reef ecosystems. So coral reefs also attract a significant amount of tourism, and this tourism is rapidly increasing, but the cumulative effects of this on the environment are not yet known, and for this reason it has become a concern for management. So diver damage has recently been cast as a concern, and it was first thought that divers don't have any impacts on the reef, but incidental damage is increasing, and this increase is a result of the improved accessibility to these sites, and this leads to more divers visiting the reefs. So as frequency increases, so will your contact and your impacts. And then how will this affect coral reefs? To understand this, we have to understand how damage is inflicted. So we have direct damage, and this involves contact with hands, gauges, or fins, for example, and this often leads to abrasions of the tissue layer covering the organisms. And this leads to energy being diverted to repair, so it impairs their reproduction and their growth. Then you also get indirect impacts, and these involve your sediment disturbance, and this often leads to the corals being smothered. So damage may accumulate under high diving pressure. This is when the rate of repair is slower than the rate of new injury, so this inhibits your recovery. And then as user intensity increases, the intervals between your damage will decrease, and this results in these cumulative effects becoming more prevalent. This also leads to reduced structural complexity, which increases the risk of smothering. There's low survival rates of these fragments, and injury also facilitates infection. So my study focused on the 2-mile reef of Sodwana Bay. These are some of the most southerly distributed reefs of the world, but what's interesting about them is that they are less affected by global bleaching events compared to reefs of the rest of the world, and therefore it's vital that we protect them from other stresses so that we can maintain this health. These reefs also benefit from their distribution within a marine protected area, as they fall under Ezemvelo Wetlands Park. And then for sustainable use, we need to understand the capacity of these reefs to support marine activities such as diving. So why is there concern in Sodwana Bay? This is because it is known as a premier diving site in South Africa, and it is frequented by around 68,000 divers a year. So therefore, divers are obviously inevitably inflicting damage. So the aim of my study was to look at the impacts of diving on the Benthic community. So what I did was look at the frequency of contact by divers, as well as their method, whether it be through direct contact with hands, fins, or indirect through the sediment disturbance. I also looked at the differences between divers, so this was their age and their experience. And I used experience rather than qualification to account for the inconsistencies regarding qualification based on a certification rather than the number of dives that they've actually logged. And then lastly, I looked at the benthic cover in both dived and undived pathways. So for the diver behaviour, I recorded 24 divers on 3 dives each, and then this was used to analyse or determine the frequency of contact per 5 minutes. And I also recorded the method of contact and the age and level of experience. And then for the benthic cover, I had taken photos along a transect and then overlaid points using coral point count. And this is done to determine the percentage cover of different substrata categories. So I used turf algae and then different types of coral, like your soft, branching, encrusting, and massive corals. So the hypotheses of my study were that frequency and method of contact would differ between the divers based on their age and experience, and that benthic cover in your dived and your undived pathways differed based on the percentage cover of those categories. And then these are the 5 sites that I looked at, so Pinnacles, Four Boy, Arches, Antons, and Bikini. And then the undived sites were just sites parallel next to the dived sites that are areas that are considered to be not dived. And that was because the dive schools often follow specific pathways, and they mostly stick to those. And then for the findings, I found that the younger divers made more intentional contact. And for the first two groups, hand contact, which is indicated by the orange bars, showed, well, they were most significant. And this was also followed by fin contact, which was also a significant contributor, and that's indicated by the yellow bars. For age, experience and contact, there was an inversely proportional relationship, but it was, however, statistically insignificant. And then the least experienced divers made 3 contacts per 5 minutes, whereas your experienced divers made 1.8 contacts per 5 minutes. However, it was found that there was no significant differences between all age groups and all levels of experience. But it's important to note that the average contact frequency in my study was found to be 458% higher than the potentially damaging rate that was suggested in 1997. So you would assume that benthic cover would be affected. However, in my study, the dived and the undived pathways were found to be not significantly different based on the percentage cover of those categories. But we can see that turf algae had the highest benthic cover in both your dived and your undived sites, that one. And that's followed by your soft coral, encrusting coral, and then branching coral, this one over here, was the only one that followed the expected trend of having a higher percentage cover in the undived sites versus the dived sites. And we also found that in the dived sites, sponge had a very high percentage cover, and this may illustrate that they may be indicators of environmental change. So the key findings were that some divers do inflict more damage than others. So in my study, I had an outlier that was excluded because of their excessive damage, and this was attributed to their use of a camera. So camera users may pose a greater threat to the coral reefs. Some divers were also found to remain about 3 meters above the reef at all times, whereas others would explore the reef in very close proximity. And then your more experienced divers were found to have better control, and they were more conservation conscious. So they often would place 2 fingers on the rock surfaces to avoid contact with the actual reefs. And then your inexperienced divers often remained at a distance. They refrained from going too close to the reef, but they did swim in a vertical position, which led to them inflicting more contact with the reef and therefore more damage. Instructor interactions may also be vital to reduce damage, because it was found that in the presence of an instructor, the divers would often change their behavior and be more cautious. And damage also depends on the ability of the coral, the affected coral, to regenerate. The corals at Sodwana Bay are also found to be quite robust, and this is because of their exposure to swell. Some species are also more susceptible to damage than others. So your branching corals, they will obviously be more prone to damage, whereas soft corals, for example, are less prone to damage, and this also explains why they had such a high percentage cover in both dived and undived sites. Others are also indicators, as I mentioned before, the sponges, and therefore it may be important to test completely undived reefs, such as your red sands reef, with these dived reefs. So to maintain the health of these reefs, the spatial and temporal variation of these impacts needs to be understood. And then many suggestions have been found in the literature, and some of these include compulsory refresher courses, and this is because the diving qualifications don't expire, and also sustainable carrying capacities for the reef, and behavior management. So this can include things like banning them from using diving gloves, which would reduce their contact with corals, pre-dive briefings with an ecological component, as well as training the staff and instructors. So although my results were insignificant, they do benefit as they help understand behavior, and they can help us to maintain the system's health. And one of the suggestions is artificial zonation, but these schemes focus on the complexity of the topography and don't always conserve all the topographical features. Hofmeyr Reef has been classified, though, based on the zones of benthic species, and this was done in 1990. Such classification schemes can be used to divide the reef into areas that are considered fragile, with your branching corals or more complex structures, versus more resilient areas that have things like soft corals. And Schleyer and Cilliers in 2005 came up with a damage probability index, And we can use this to restrict divers to certain areas of the reef based on their competence and experience. And this will allow us to ensure sustainable use of the reef and a balance between recreation and conservation, allowing the reef to maintain its resilience but still allowing recreational and economic benefits. Thank you.